Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started because we have a lot to cover this morning, and I don't want to keep anybody waiting or to cut any of our panelists off. Thank you so much for joining us for our webinar series, 5 Unexpected Conversations You Can Have at Work. Today, we are going to focus on identifying the issues, and I'm thrilled to have my fellow panelists join us today. I have Esther Cardenas Pipoly, I have Allison De Paoli, Cathy Sikorski, and John Troutman. And we're going to jump right into it, and we are going to kick things off with why mental health matters, identifying the issue. Our first speaker this morning will be Esther Cardenas Pipoly, and she will introduce herself and her topic. Go ahead, Esther.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm so pleased to be with you and kick off this series today. My name is Esther Cardenas Pipoly. As Nancy said, I'm from San Antonio, Texas, and I'm the owner and founder of Loss of Life Advocates, also known as LOLA, helping employers navigate difficult conversations with their employees during a life transition or loss. I'm really happy to be kicking off the series right now, so let's get to it. Next slide. We're going to talk a little bit about a loss of a loved one. And I know for many of us, this is pretty personal. And for me, it was personal too. Next slide. Because this was me on the floor of my employer's 5th floor bathroom in 2014. I had lost my father and my husband 63 days apart, both to cancer, and my employer didn't really know what to do with me. They were trying to give me all the different supporting benefits and phone numbers and people to talk to, but I really needed somebody to hold my hand. And I'm here to tell you that life transitions in the workplace, you need to understand what that is, what that means, what they are. So today I'm going to tell you, grief is real, grief is physical, and grief takes time. Like the airport, when planes land, nobody lands in the same 2 places when it comes to grief. Next slide. So let's talk about the different types of loss. For most of us, we always go straight to almost the bottom, death of a loved one. For me, in my own particular episode of my own life, it was my husband and my father dying so quickly, quickly together. But actually, my first loss was my mother back in 1999. And that was a huge loss for me. And at that time, my employer, again, really wasn't sure what to do other than send flowers and food. But let's talk about the other types of losses, like a major medical diagnosis, ALS, cancer, Alzheimer's, dementia, a financial loss when one of your employees' spouses maybe loses their job or they've gone through a big financial loss in the stock market. Empty nest. This is a pretty important one that we don't think about. When parents go through their kids leaving for college, what now? I think me and my husband screamed at each other when my daughter left for school. It was a real sense of loss for both of us, no longer having a child to navigate around what their schedules were. Aging parents. This is really a pretty important one that Cathy is going to talk about later on, how our parents age and how it affects us as caregivers while we're trying to hold down our job and take care of our families. The loss of a pet, personally, probably one of the worst for me personally. Marriage, of course, if you go through a divorce, this is something that's important. This can be a financial loss to one of your employees. Their whole life can change because of a divorce, and this impacts you. And probably one of the worst, of course, death of a loved one. And finally, trust. When you trust somebody that you rely on for their confidentiality and they violate that, that is a huge loss. Next slide. So let's talk about Dr. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. Many of us know her. She is the one that coined the 5 stages of grief and loss. And we use these loosely when we go through trying to support somebody that we know has suffered through losing somebody they love. Denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance. She actually created these 5 stages for the person that's actually going through the loss, the actual dying person. And when you take a step back and think about it, I know personally, I could see that with each person that I watched die. They go through that denial, the anger, the bargaining, the depression, and the acceptance. But over the years, this has transferred over to the people that survive. And we sometimes can tell us, looking at another employee that we're working, a coworker, oh, they're angry. They're in their anger part of this stage. It really was intended for the person that was dying, but now we can actually use these to identify what somebody's going through afterwards as well. And I love this picture because it talks about the sea. And I always tell people, we all live in a sea of grief. You coming today to join us for this conversation means that we all have something that we're going through. We're all going through some type of loss. So thank you for joining us. Next slide. Words matter. I always try to pause here, not only because I love the elephant and the bunny sitting next to each other, but what's really important is what you say and how you say it. It is important. So how many of you today have personally gone through a situation in your workplace where a coworker has had a major loss or a transition in their family, and you're trying to figure out, well, what do I say? What do I do? Well, words do matter. Next slide. So let's talk about some of the words that we sometimes say. They're myths. I often call them knee-jerk reactions. They're misinformation around death, automatic critical responses that I learned through the grief recovery method. Things that we say when somebody goes through a loss. Oh, don't feel bad. Your loved one's no longer suffering. Or don't cry. Stiff upper lip. 3, go and be alone. Leave them alone. Let them be alone. Maybe they want to be alone and they're isolating. It takes time to go through grief. Be strong. This was one of the ones that people kept saying to me, you're so strong. I just really wanted to lie down. Keep busy. When the busier you are, the faster you can go through your grief. Well, these are some of the things that people say, just automatic. My most favorite one is probably, I'm so sorry. I don't know about you, but I just automatically go to that saying when I'm talking to somebody about going through a loss. I'm so sorry for your loss. The truth is, put an emotion behind it. I'm really sad that you lost your mother. I'm really sad, or I'm very frustrated for you. How can I help you? I hope this helps you. Next slide. STERBS. These are my favorite, short-term emotional release boosters. I see them all the time, and I'm sure you do with your employees or your coworkers. Somebody comes into work after a loss or a life transition. Maybe they're eating too much. Maybe they're not eating at all. They're skipping meals, or they're drinking too much and they're coming in a little hungover. Or maybe they were a drinker and now they've stopped drinking, sleeping too much or not sleeping enough. This also goes hand in hand with anxiety. Exercising. I know that I was personally spinning my legs off as fast as I could because I did not know how to deal with my grief. Shopping, gambling, workaholicism. Those people, you get to work, they've gone through a loss and they're there before you get there. And you're like, wow. And then they're there and they stay later. That's a STERB. Isolation, people that just don't want to go anywhere, don't want to do anything, and just want to be alone. And our favorite, social media nonstop, LinkedIn posts, Facebook posts, just stalking, being on Instagram, not wanting to get off to have to deal with the real world. These are some STERBs. One of my favorite words that you should get used to being able to identify these things that are happening in your workplace when you have an employee going through a loss. Next slide. So how does STERBS affect you and your health? We're going to dive in deeper to why the cost and the causation of this and how it can affect you as an employer or a broker for your groups. STERBS can affect you by your employees maybe getting a diagnosis of a disease, cancer, digestive problems, headaches or migraines, high blood pressure, and anxiety. I can tell you I always lived in the world of low blood pressure before my husband and my father died. And I now live in a world with high blood pressure and anxiety. I've learned to deal with it, but it's something that even after 7 years, I'm still consistently working towards. Next slide. The grief and cause of fear and anxiety in the workplace. One of my favorite shows, The Office, of course, understanding the different personalities of your team is important. So I'm just going to walk you through the different personalities through DISC so that you can maybe identify some of the things that are behaviors that are going on with your employees after a loss or a life transition. Our dominating personality, D. These are personalities that'll get back to work right away, feeling like they may lose their position. It's about 3% of your sales force or your workforce out there. These are the people that'll be at a funeral and actually be texting or looking at their emails. The I personalities, your influencers, personalities will talk even more and want to convince you they're fine and okay. This is about 11% of your workforce. They're the ones that talk and talk and talk and talk and try to tell you everything's just fine. The S personalities are the ones that are suffering from the loss of security. They require a lot of reassurances, and this is a majority of your employees that are working for you, 69%. That was me. I was an S. And then C, your personalities will want all the information on the rules and regulations around their benefits and what's expected from them. This is about 17%, the people that, do the spreadsheets for you in Excel, and they want to see those fine print of FMLA and their short-term disability contracts. You know those people. I hope this has helped you just a little bit see how important knowing the behavior styles of your team plays into a loss or a life transition. Next slide. So knowing the cues. So what now? Using simple words, using emotions and kind gestures. I often work with employers after they've gone through a loss in their workplace. And for some personalities, maybe that D personality or that C personality, they don't know really what to say. So maybe leaving a candy bar and a sticky note sometimes can help. No two people process a life transition or loss the same, just like we talked about with the airplane, and always proceed with caution. Knowing when and where and your timing of when you're talking to them will be an impactful way for you to make sure that you're actually looking out for your workforce, looking out for your coworkers. And all of this affects the emotional well-being of us. So it's not just, the feelings that we worry about during the time when somebody's going through a loss or a life transition, but more importantly, the overall wellness of your organization. I now want to turn you over to Allison De Paoli, who's going to now put numbers to how these things affect us. Allison?
Thank you, Esther. Good morning, everybody. Good afternoon. I'm Allison De Paoli, as you know. I have been working with employers who have been sure that there's nothing that they can do to contain their healthcare costs or improve their user experience, which we don't talk about nearly enough, for several years with some good successes. I am the co-author of the Amazon bestseller, Breaking Through the Status Quo: How Innovative Companies Are Changing the Benefits Game to Help Their Employees and Boost Their Bottom Line. And in 2019, I was a top Women in Advising honoree, and I was just recognized as the most innovative healthcare consultant at an industry event. So I'm also the one that always talks about numbers and why doing the right thing is the best thing for your budget. Next slide. So that's a really big number, right? $4.1 trillion. According to CMS, the Center, for Medicare Services, in 2020, we in the United States spent $4.1 trillion on healthcare. That is a lot of money, and there's a significant amount of waste there. Next slide, please. So according to Aligning for Health, which is an industry think tank, 80 to 90% of all healthcare expenditures are related to the social determinants of health, not actual medical issues. That is $3.2 trillion. We'll talk about social determinants of health in just a second, but let's conservatively say that of that $3.2 trillion, 25% is spent on mental health issues. That is 820 billion with a B. So, we've lost some zeros there, but that is still a lot of money, and it can look like such a huge problem to solve. What we hope to do today is start the discussion on how you can have an positive impact on your own workforce. And if we can all do that, then we can make a good dent in that $820 billion. Next slide. So social determinants of health. Typically, there are 5. The first 2, there's not really much we can do about in the workplace: genetics and environmental and physical influences. Most of our workplaces are safe, and, genetics is just not something we deal with in the workforce for the most part. But we can talk about access to medical care, behavioral health issues, and social factors. Let's talk about access to care. It is the biggest problem I think we have in the industry. And I also want to talk about high quality care. As a country, we don't have good information to access who is a good doctor and who is maybe not the best doctors. And I know everyone thinks that they have the best physician, but let me show you an example of what can happen and why it's important. So those of you that know me on this call have seen this slide before. This is the quality score. It's an empirical data, provider reported to CMS, and a data aggregator generates this report. This is this quality score of my mother's cardiologist, 27.8. And if you look down where the red circle is, patient safety, 5.9. Now, I'm pretty sure that most of you would not want your mother going to a cardiologist like this, nor would you want to go to a cardiologist, nor would you want anybody on your team going to a cardiologist like this. Yet we don't make it easy for people to find that out. But let me tell you what the result of this score was. The result of this physician was a 3-day hospital stay, a stent placement, a $37,000 bill. It was pretty avoidable. But let's go back to this cardiac issue for a minute. We know there's good data everywhere that anxiety, stress, depression lead to high blood pressure, can lead to strokes, can lead to heart attacks. All right, so if we can help alleviate some of that, we can reduce the chance of a heart attack, if only tangentially. To give you some perspective there, the average cost of a hospital stay for a heart attack is $21,000. And total costs over a lifetime for a serious cardiac patient can be over $1 million. The average cost of a stroke is $103,576. If you can prevent one of these things, you have done the right thing for the humans, and almost on accident, you have done the right thing for your budget. Next slide. So let's talk about how this financial cost impacts you directly. I know that $4.1 trillion seems so amorphous. That boils down to $12,530 that you spend on medical care for every employee that you have. If we go back to that 80% is determined by the social determinants of health factors in your organization, that there's $10,024 of expense. Now, let's say we could impact just 25% of that. That is $2,506. To me, that seems like a much more manageable number to address. So let's take that one step further and talk about what that looks like on an annual basis. Next slide. All righty. If you are an average sized employer in the United States, if you can save $2,506 per person, that's an annual savings of $47,614. That's real money when you have 19 employees. That's a big chunk of your benefits budget. Many of you think you can't see what your claims are what's happening with your claims. You can. Conversation for another day. If you have 100 employees, that's an annual savings of $250,600. And if you have 1,000 employees, that's $2.5 million a year. So simply by using tools you may already have in your arsenal, you can impact the mental health, the physical health of your workplace, improve it, and improve your budget at the same time. I'm going to turn it over to John Troutman now, who is going to talk about that in a little bit more detail.
Allison, those are some powerful numbers. Hopefully everybody could take some notes there as well. That's excellent, Allison, and thank you for the introduction. I am John Troutman. I am the National Director of Marketing for Mazzitti Sullivan EAP Services. I am also a keynote speaker and a consultant and business life coach for a number of advisors around the country. I am a survivor of burnout, and by that, I don't have the time to go into all the details, but I was in a very dark place. I lost a lot of friends, and to follow up with what Esther spoke of, I never took the time to process those deaths that I went through along that way, including the death of my best friend who died on a treadmill, very traumatic events that just took its toll, and I never took that time. So I can speak to employers, to advisors, and look them in the eyes and talk to them about the power that mental health will take on you personally if you don't take care of yourself. So thank you so much for allowing me to be with you today, and thanks for joining us as we look at the uncertainty in the world and workplace, and resiliency. We're going to go right to our next slide here, Nancy. Thank you. So the impact of assumptions. I believe there are things that we take, quite frankly, for granted every night before we fall asleep. These are assumptions that we take and that we make, that the sun's going to rise in the morning, that we're going to rise in the morning, right? We just assume that we're going to feel okay. And that is not always the case. That our vehicle is going to start. I've got friends in the north and in Canada, and that's a big if sometimes when weather is changing, and especially this time of the year, that we're going to feel our best, that we're going to be our best, that our relationships will be healthy and engaging, or for our employers here joining us today or in the days to come that are watching on video, that their employees are okay with their mental health. So we need to take note of this quote over here on the side. Assumptions damage our ability to relate to others. If you are always assuming you know how others think and feel, you stop listening and communicating and leave them feeling trapped or misunderstood. Relationship difficulties, whether at work or at home, can lead to lost opportunities, low self-esteem, and even depression. It damages our ability to relate to others. I want you to think about that just for a moment. And again, in your own time after this podcast, think about the many things that you may take for granted, the assumptions that you may take each and every day, because they do stack up over time and they impact our expectations of the day. And then we become disappointed by our outcomes because simply we just assumed that things were going to be a certain way. Our next slide. So certainty is an illusion. I want you to take a moment and just look at that image and whether you think of it that way. And as I think of my own life, I think of the trajectory that I took just being in what I'm doing over the course of 3 years. It was much more like a pile of spaghetti that was thrown at the wall than a straight line, right? But yet we often have these assumptions. Oh, it's going to be this way. And I assume it's going to be that way. And that really is not reality. Certainty is an illusion. Instead of trying to avoid uncertainty, work to expand the capacities of those around you to take courageous action in its presence, unlearning old ways of working and experimenting with new ones. The maxim that fortune favors the bold is never truer than when fear runs high. Now, this is certainly a challenge, and we're with you all today to talk about these challenges. Unlearning old ways of working and experimenting with new ones can be very scary for many different people. And Esther spoke about DISC and the different types of people that are on this call and the different personality profiles that exist. I have many dear friends that are not fans of change in any way, shape, or form. So to embrace that can be a great challenge for people, even when things are going well. So unlearning those old ways, working with and looking at new ways is a great way to look at that when challenging things are going on in our world. Our next slide. Choosing the victor over the victim mindset. Disruptive change. I have many advisors who are close, dear friends. And on many occasions throughout the course of the last 2 years, they've asked me, how can I deal with someone who's dealing with whatever, or how can I handle whatever? And this infographic here from Al Siebert, he is the founder of the Resiliency Center. He took 25 years to study people who were lost at sea and survived, who were prisoners of war. And he compared all these individuals who are the healthiest ones out of these traumatic situations. And one of the things that he found is that how they handled disruptive change produced a better outcome for them. So this is a challenge. Certainly, this is a key here for us and a way and a path. And we're going to, in our next podcast, be looking at in more in depth how you get to that victor mindset, but we get to choose. Certainly, we go through the process, no matter what that disruptive change is, that we feel like we're attacked. When I had COVID about 3 weeks ago, I did not want it a second time. I felt attacked, but I approached it differently since it was my second time. I still felt numb because I couldn't believe that I got it again. And I wasn't pleased with that. And over the course of time, because of some of the outcomes, and I'll be transparent here and say, I had brain fog. And in my world, in my position, that doesn't sit well with me. And I became upset. I also got to a point where I was the victim, and then the victim mindset settled in. So it was a challenge for me to choose. This is a major challenge for everybody. So it doesn't matter what your position is on this call. It doesn't matter what your relationships are like. It doesn't matter how much money you make. We all have to make a choice. And it is a challenge. At that moment, when we are feeling like the victim, we get to choose. We can either look for coping ways, we can look for solutions, or we can stay frustrated and we can be the victim really forever. Nothing will change. So a huge challenge in this whole process in going through difficult times and being more resilient is getting to cope, to resile, and eventually thrive with whatever we're dealing with. Our next slide. Communication. Communication is something that employers are challenged with, and it's not just simply communicating. I hear from employers, I hear from advisors, well, we send them this information. And to those who are on this call who are in the benefit space, the difference of having people understand, right? It's not just them knowing. Most of us can process the information. So, oh, okay, I at the 30,000 foot, I can understand what you're saying, but do we really grasp it? Can we explain it to someone else? So communicating to our employees in that challenging time is very valuable. Employees trust leaders who keep them informed and stay in tune with how they are doing personally. Taking that extra time. I'm not just speaking, and I won't go through all those ways that are solutions today, but taking the time to communicate in every method possible, especially face-to-face. And yes, those of you who hate the phone, pick it up anyway and communicate. Go the extra mile. There really isn't any such thing as over communicating when you're going through a challenging time, as long as you're doing your best to communicate to your workforce where you are and where you're headed. Our next slide. Culture. I have a key word here of orchestrate your employees on mission and values. I love all forms of music, truly. And in the morning, you're going to hear one style. Through most of my day, you're going to hear classical. The rest of the day, you can hear a whole bunch of other styles. But orchestrate. What does it take to get an orchestra to sound fantastic to your ears? Just because I went to the National Theater and heard the world's greatest violinist play Vivaldi's Four Seasons does not mean that if she gave me that violin, I could do an adequate job. It would be terrible. Orchestrating your employees, giving them training, giving them time, and explaining to them so they understand the mission and values. Just because you have the mission and values inside your front door doesn't mean they will get it. And when employees are aligned with company culture and values, they are more likely to thrive during a crisis or times of heightened stress. Ask an employee. Pick one out of the crowd. Can you explain what our mission and values are? Not that you're going to be judging them on it, but see if they know and take that opportunity to communicate that and better teach them. Our next slide. Capabilities. Investing in your employees' training and adding appropriate tools. Capabilities. The smartest organizations continue to offer employee trainings during challenging times and continue to upgrade appropriate tools. These opportunities allow the employees to improve their skills and help them look beyond their current circumstances and be able to become more resilient and have much more of a future-focused mindset. Future-focused mindset. Very briefly, I had an employer reach out to me, or actually an employee reach out to me and question why their employer was giving them new tools during the height, what they perceived as the height of COVID. Why are they doing this now? So much is going on. We're concerned about jobs. Why are they giving this new technology and new training? And you know what I could say to them? Because they want to develop you, because they believe in you, and they want you to have a future-focused mindset. I know that's a challenge, but there are things we can do that may not even cost us money to invest in our employees. Our next slide. Change. Helping our employees adapt to disruptions. For when disruptions occur, leaders should quickly identify the effects on both individuals and teams and explore ways that individuals can better support one another. At Mazzitti Sullivan EAP, we were not able to go remote right away before COVID hit. And we were forced to make decisions to impact the entire organization so that we could cover the groups, knowing that mental health was going to be on the rise. And we had to adapt. We had to change to the different departments, the different divisions. We were forced. Well, we chose, right? We weren't forced. We chose to take time to process what's going on with our teams. What's really going on with our different divisions? What can we do to better support them so they can adapt and change? That's a learning part for all of us to choose that. We might feel like we're forced upon it, but we get to choose. Our next slide. So lastly here, there's takeaways and keys. And just remind you all, we get to choose. It's victim or the victor in how and the many forms of communication. The importance of culture and rehashing and re-hitting mission and values, capabilities, investing in our employees' training and adding tools to have them be future focused, and change, helping our employees adapt in the various areas to all that's going on. These will improve resiliency and help everyone be much more resilient going through different challenging times. Thank you so much. And I am going to turn it over to Nancy at this time.
Thank you, John. That was awesome. So I will apologize to both my co-hosts and everybody attending because apparently I was only able to turn my own camera on. So anyway, these are lovely people, as you can see by their pictures, and I'm sorry you couldn't see them as they were speaking to you. So to introduce myself, my name is Nancy Giacalone, and I'm an independent consultant in the employee benefit space. I have owned my own agency for over 26 years. I've been in the industry for a few more years than that. In addition to that, I am the host of a weekly podcast called Recipe for Success. I continue to educate on the topic of healthcare through entertaining and informative videos. And I was also recognized as a 2020 Top Women in Advising by Benefits Pro magazine. So I get the trickier topic today. We are going to talk about relationship issues and abuse. And what I have to say about this is if it affects you and or your employee, it affects your work. So we're going to talk about the issues and how you can recognize them and be prepared. So very interesting statistic is 1 in 4 women and 1 in 9 men are affected by domestic abuse totally for over 10 million people every single year. And that comes from the National Coalition Against Domestic Violence. Think about that number. If you do that math, you know somebody. You may know about it or you may not, but you know somebody that's affected by it. So why should we talk about this at work? I mean, this seems like something that doesn't belong in the work environment, but I'm telling you it does. 21% of all full-time workers have been the victim of domestic violence. That's just under 1 in 4. Count how many people are around you in your workplace. Somebody's been a victim. It impacts productivity in the workplace. That person is not productive. If they're talking about it, other people are losing productivity. So it can have a pretty significant impact. It can also create an environment of fear. People may be worried that there's somebody out there that's going to come into the workplace and it might impact them. So again, very real impact. It can create absenteeism. Obviously, if somebody is going through something difficult, they may need to take time off for legal resources, for mental health resources, for physical recovery even. So one thing we're going to talk about is that a well-organized policy can provide safe haven when all else feels very uncertain. So what can you do? I mean, again, this seems like a big topic, especially that we're talking about at work. And I think that first and foremost, and I'm going to harken back to something Esther brought up in the very beginning, is understand that words matter. You need to choose your words carefully, both in communicating company policies and dealing with somebody that may be going through an experience. Build awareness around the issue. It is so taboo. Even in today's society, it's still very taboo for somebody to say, I have experienced domestic violence, because somehow they feel that they've done something wrong. And clearly we understand that that's not the issue, but we need to start talking about it. We need to make it something that people are comfortable expressing. This is something I'm going through, something I'm trying to deal with. The other thing too is you need to be very clear if you're coming to someone as an employer that you want to help and not judge. This is hard because the person probably already feels judged. Whether you've said a word or not, they might feel very much the victim. They might feel that somehow that they've done something to cause it. So one thing that I recommend is practice with a friend or coworker or even a family member what you're going to say and get their input on how it comes across prior to broaching the victimized employee. So do a dry run and have your resources ready prior to talking with the employee. You want to have things that you can hand them, not just tell them what they can do. How do you get in touch with the Employee Assistance Program? Most of you probably have one, but the fact of the matter is, does the employee know? Sure, you talked about it at open enrollment, but print that piece of paper out, hand it to the employees so that they have that information handy. What mental health services are available? Most plans have more than they ever have had in the past, including virtual services. Make sure you have those resources tangible and handy to share with the employee. Do you have a policy of what to expect and what actions need to be taken? You should. It's really important. And review your PTO policies to determine if they're adequate. Finally, determine if the rest of your staff is safe and what you can do to ensure their safety. This is something that as a small employer that we experienced, and I didn't have a policy in place. I didn't know what to do. So like most everyone else, after the fact, I figured it out. But it was a big learning experience for me because then I understood how I could better support someone going through that, as well as my other employees and my business as well. So make sure you have a policy. Okay, so domestic violence is at the far end of the spectrum, but what other relationship issues impact the workplace and your employees? Well, divorce is a big one. And we use the word divorce, but it could be splitting up from a significant other. There could be other things that fall into this category, but I am going to use the term divorce for the purposes of this webinar. The impact of businesses of divorce and relationship issues is in excess of $300 billion per year. You saw some of those numbers that Allison put up. This backs it right up. $300 billion per year. Do you think that it might be worth your time to figure out how you can better support your employees? The average employee loses 168 hours of work time in the year after the divorce. And if you think about it, it doesn't just affect that employee, it affects their coworkers too, and the culture and the productivity of the employer, because everyone is stepping in to pick up the slack. So think about that. How can you build an opportunity to diminish that impact? There's lost productivity in the form of mental, physical, and creatively. Depending on the type of job your employees perform, these things can have a huge impact. They're not going to show up on your bottom line, but they are definitely going to impact the productivity of that employee. Somebody who prior to going through something like this may have been operating at 80 to 90%, all of a sudden they're at 30 to 40%, that's costing you money. We already talked about absenteeism. Again, 168 hours, and they're not always planned and they're not always convenient, so they can have a pretty big impact on your business. Increased errors and accidents. If somebody's in a physical job, accidents can have a tremendous impact. And if they're in a job such as employee benefits or the insurance industry and their calculations are wrong, again, huge impacts to everyone. It's not just I made a mistake. That mistake can have a snowball effect and repercussions far down the road. The employee can have a harder time concentrating, maybe having poor decision-making skills, and be very distractible. So what should you do? If you're an employer, I'll say it again, understand that words matter. Talk to your employees directly about what's going on. Tell them, I don't need to know the details, but let them know you'd like to support them. don't shy away from the discussion. Definitely go to the employee and say, it seems to me you may be going through something. Would you like to tell me about it? And again, let them know you don't need to know the details. And to go along with that, nip gossip in the bud. So if their coworkers are talking about it, definitely try to stop that because their situation is painful enough already. Encourage use of flex time if that's an option. Talk to them. What do you need? How much time are you going to need to deal with some of these issues? And give them that freedom to have their calls and correspondence with attorneys, family members, etc., off work premises during their own time. Work with them to come up with a plan. And if you're an employee, talk to your manager. Again, remember, you do not have to go into detail, but they're going to be more supportive if they understand what you're going through. In conjunction with that, if you work for a larger employee, definitely talk to HR. Ask for the flexibility up front. Let them know, I'm going to be dealing with this for X amount of time. I'm not sure, but I think I might need this. Let them know, and you're going to have a much better outcome. Start planning your new life. Think about the good things that are ahead for you. Seek support and counseling, and don't make rash decisions. And finally, similar to what we talked about with the loss of life with Esther, practice good self-care. Make sure that you're eating well, sleeping, exercising, get out for a walk. Exercise doesn't have to be a crazy thing. It can just be getting up and moving. And then finally, avoid numbing and coping through the use of drugs and alcohol. 1 in every 42 seconds. Every 42 seconds, there is one divorce in America. The issue isn't going away, so be prepared. Start thinking about how you can better support your employees in domestic violence, divorce, and relationship issues. And with that, I am going to turn it over to Cathy, who is going to talk to us about caregiving.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm so happy to be here. I'm Cathy Sikorski. I am an elder lawyer. I am a speaker and an author, and my latest book, 12 Conversations, How to Talk to Almost Anyone About Long-Term Care Planning, includes a very important chapter on work, which is what I'm here to talk about today. Next slide, please. So my job is to tell you who is the caregiver, but more importantly, why does it matter at work? And that's a really good question that we're going to delve into right now. Who is the caregiver? Well, we're talking here about unpaid family caregivers. So I thought the best way to look at it would be through the journalist question, the way an investigative journalist looks at this kind of a thing, which is who, where, what, when, why, and how. Because these unpaid family caregivers are not unpaid people. They're working. They're just unpaid in their caregiving job. And that is right now, apparently 44 to 63 million, a wide swath of people across the United States. And you can see the quote from Rosalind Carter that tells us there's really only 4 kinds of people in the world: those who have been, who currently are, who will be caregivers, and those who will need care. Next slide, please. So who are the caregivers? Here are the demographics. And I'm not going to read this to you, but I would love for you to take a screenshot of this, because if you are an employee, this is going to make you feel empowered. You're going to know that this is in fact you, and you're not going to feel so alone. If you're an employer, I think it's really important for you to understand how many ways caregiving cuts across your employee base. So this is who they are, but next slide, please, Nancy. This is what it really looks like. They say a picture is worth 1,000 words. So here we have maybe a mom and a daughter, an adult daughter, but we're not really sure who is the caregiver, but it could be either of them. And it cuts across all agencies, all ages, all ethnicities. It's really out there in every way. Next slide. But we often forget that men are caregivers. And yes, mostly the demographics still skew towards women. They are a larger percentage of putting in that unpaid family caregiving work, but men are definitely stepping up more and more every day. And they're probably being ignored more and more because of it, because they haven't been the typical family caregiver. Next. Young people. Millennials are a full 25% of that 44 to 63 million unpaid family caregivers. That is a huge number and a large part of our workforce. So we cannot ignore that even young people are picking up the caregiving job. Next. I don't want to discount childcare though. Often when we talk about elder care, everybody or caregiving, everybody thinks, oh, you're taking care of old people or you're taking care of disabled people. But childcare is still caregiving. And yes, childcare has fortunately come out of the closet in a very big way in the last few years. There was a time when there was a big stigma attached to that, but not so much anymore. However, it's still a caregiving issue and it still does affect work. Next. Grandparents are caregivers, but you know what? Grandparents are working longer. We're working as older all of the time. These grandparents could be taking care of grandchildren as well as being a part of your workforce. Next. And there are people who have been caregivers for a very long time. This is not new, certainly not to them. Next. And caregivers are often friends, not even a family member. Yes, this is me actually with my best friend who had a traumatic brain injury 10 years ago. She's perfectly fine. She thought that that was actually a very funny test that she had to take, and lets me share this picture. But so you can understand that caregivers even include people who are not related to the people they're caring for. And this is what it really looks like at work. Your caregivers are frustrated, they're tired, and they're burning out. Next. So now we know who the caregivers are. Where are they? There are almost, you can see that these numbers, yes, full-time workers is a large percentage, but also working 30 to 39 hours a week. There was a time when working 37.5 hours a week was considered a full-time job. So people are working a lot of hours and also working as unpaid caregivers when they get home. And it's a large portion of our working population. But here's the craziest part. Half of the entire workforce fully expects to be providing care in the future for an elder in the next 5 years. And how do we know this? Well, I have a very good friend who is a Medicare expert. She gets health insurance for people who are 65 years and older, right? But once they turn 65, and we have 10,000 people a day turning age 65. So they may be getting care very soon, but they also are caring for people in their 80s and 90s and still working. Next. So why do we need to pay attention to this at work? Well, caregiving and COVID sort of threw those doors open, didn't it? It eventually became crystal clear in the last 2 years that this was a problem that could no longer be hidden. People were now taking care of their kids at home. They were bringing their elders into the house because it didn't seem safe. And what happened was we started to have the Great Resignation, which of course, again, affected women in a larger, much larger way, because it's presumed that about 4 to 6 million people actually quit their jobs in the last 2 years. But it was fueled by 4 things. People started to find a work-life balance because they could work from home. And the caregiving responsibility was something that they were not willing to give up or change readily. But of course, as John told us, it led to burnout. And then what happened? Then they went on a quest to get flexible work arrangements because they realized, oh my goodness, I could actually do this. And stats are great, but they're really stories about people, right? So I want to tell you real quickly about Carrie Hannon, who wrote an article for Next Avenue and Forbes, where she was taking care of her 91-year-old mom during the last few years. And she realized that the resources for her were just really, really difficult to find. She also highlighted someone named Isabel, who stayed home with her parents who were in their 70s. One was having dementia issues and the other was hospitalized often. And Isabel had to return to work. This article came out last month. She returned to full-time in-office work, and she's considering quitting her job now because she cannot make the balance happen anymore. Next slide. So what does this do to your business? It has a huge impact. So here's 2 truths and a lie. I'd like, if I had a polling ability, we would do it, but we can't do that today. So just read 1, 2, and 3. I'll give you just a second. Most people pick number 3. 73% of employers report caregiving responsibilities. This number seems to be far too high, right? But in actuality, it's number 1. Actually, 24% of employers think caregiving has an impact on their business. 24%. If 73% of employees are having caregiving responsibilities, it should be a lot more than 24% of employers recognizing that. Because as you can see in the next paragraph, there is a huge hidden cost of care. You have turnover, you have reduced productivity, you have retention issues, you have retraining issues. But here's the craziest part. Your high titled and more responsible employees, your management employees, your employees who are at the C-suite are the ones who are going to leave or change their job. What drives your profitability is what you're losing. Next slide. So when is this happening? Now, 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 and now. It's happening now, my friends. Next slide. What can we do about it? How can we fix it? I know, but that's the next event, a teaser, right? We're going to go on a scavenger hunt. But in the meantime, I really want you to look at 4 things. Recognize that this is in fact a challenge. 24% is not enough. Look at your corporate culture. And this clearly crosses across everything that we've talked about today from all of our speakers. The C-suite down has to open the door to this. And the frontline workers up have to be less stigmatized about it. We have talked about taboo and difficult conversations and stigmatization of all of these things with Esther and with Nancy and with John and with Allison. What we talked about is that there is money to be saved and money to be made because you already have resources in place that you're not using. And we have some new solutions that may actually help you find money. What could be better? So I hope you're looking forward to our next event. That's it for me.
Thank you, Cathy. Thank you everybody for joining us. I'm going to open it up for questions. So anybody can pop in. So just to be clear about this, today our focus was on identifying the issues and really saying, these are real issues. They do have a real impact. And our next session, which is going to be on March 22nd, is really going to be employer facing or broker facing or vendor facing, if you enjoy this. But it's really about how do we start to identify what resources and the support for employers. And then our final session, which will be in April, will be employee facing. It'll be how to approach your employer about these things. How do I find the resources? So we're pretty excited about having everyone here. So if there's any questions, you please feel free to unmute yourself or raise your hand and I can unmute you so you can ask any questions or you can pop it into the chat. Oops, sorry about that. All right, well, again, I would like to thank everyone for joining us. I would like to apologize to my co-hosts for not getting the video right. Oh, good. We've gotten a few thank yous. I promise for the next one, everybody will be live video because I feel a little bit odd being the only one. Thanks. Oh, here we have a question. With 1 in 54 children impacted with autism, hang on a second here, let's see. With 1 in 54 children impacted with autism, I'm just trying to add to your slides. I'm a parent myself who quit working to take care of our kiddo. I had somebody say, can we get a recording of this? Yes, this was recorded. You just need to respond to the follow-up email. Let me know you'd like a copy. Also, I'm happy to send the slides if you'd like that. Autism, Cathy, did you want to speak to that as far as impacting the caregivers?
Oh yeah, I'm. You can hear me, right?
Yep.
Yeah, I was just typing to her for that. But yes, Gina, you are absolutely right about that. And that is the whole point, that caregiving goes across the board. There is nobody who is, deemed not a caregiver just because it's their children or their mom or their friend or their aunt. They deserve all the respect and all the resources that we have at our hands, both as an employer and as a community, to help them take care of their job and remain good and well-valued employees. And we can do that. I really believe we can do that.
Great. Well, thank you everyone for joining. If you think of things that you would specifically like to ask us or for us to address at our next session, please feel free to email or message any one of us via LinkedIn or as a response to, again, the follow-up that you'll get from this webinar. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining, and I hope everyone has a great day.